San Mateo County Libraries is excited to host K-Ming Chang, a Kundiman Fellow, Lambda Literary Award finalist, and a National Book Foundation 5 Under 35 honoree. Bestiary is a New York Times Book Reviews editor's choice and follows 3 generations of Taiwanese-American women, mother, daughter, and grandmother, who are haunted by the myths of their homeland. Poetic and visceral, Bestiary is a tale of migration, queer lineages, and girlhood. We're so glad to have you here today.
Hi, thank you so much for introing me. Yeah, I'm so excited to be here, and thanks for all your support. And thanks to everyone who's here as well. Should I start off with my reading, 5 minutes from the book? Great.
Yes.
I'll try to talk louder, and if at any point you can't hear me, feel free to let me know in the chat, and I can speak up louder as well. So I'll read from 2 brief portions of the book. The first section. Well, actually, I'll just I'll explain the second section later. But this first section is narrated from the perspective of a character named Daughter. This book follows 3 generations, and she's the youngest generation. Meng Jiangnu grew at the rate of a tree and could be fed only soil, silt, water, insecticide in the form of vinegar. The 2 families took turns watering her, but she never grew more than an inch per year. By the time she was a girl, her mothers and fathers were dead. She outlived the 2nd generation of the family, then the 3rd, each generation leaving a written set of instructions for the care of the gourd girl. Keep her buried waist deep in soil at all times. Turn her face to the sun. Stimulate her roots by stroking them. Water her. Prune her hair twice a week. If you see moss on her skin, beat it off with a broom. Meng Jiangnu was planted in a trench dug between the Meng and Jiang courtyards. Her body was hollow, and the neighborhood boys liked to sneak onto the estate. They carved her a pair of ear holes and shouted into them, heard their own names echo back. They dared one another to cut her down, bring her home, plant themselves in her body. My mother said, when my ba was born, there were daughter trees. When a daughter was born, every family planted a camphor tree outside their home. Its branches grew parallel to her bones. Sometimes the tree grew scales down its trunk and sprouted a single jellied eye like a fish. And sometimes the tree had a mouth in the center of the trunk, where birds were born, except these birds had no feathers, just skin, flightless as fists. When the matchmaker walked by your house and saw that the tree had grown to the width of a waist, she knew it was time for your daughter to be married away. The daughter tree was cut down, chiseled into trunks to carry her clothes and bedding. When my mother was born, Agong tried planting a camphor tree outside the military village where they lived, but the soil there was incestuous with the sea and too salty. The tree was salt thick, its trunk crumbling. Every day, Agong measured its waist with his hands, but it remained the width of his wrist. My mother was relieved. As long as the tree never grew wide enough to be wed, she'd never have to leave home. She asked of every tree she saw, don't ever grow a body worth cutting down. It was Agong who felled the tree one morning, plucking the trunk from the ground as easily as an arrow shaft, its only 2 branches braided together like my mother's legs when she was born. After he broke the tree into shrapnel with his bare hands, my mother tried plucking the eyelash-fine splinters from his palms, but the shards submarined through his blood, merging wood with marrow. That's why he was so flammable, why his memories were already smoke, why he wasn't allowed to touch the stove, newspapers, our hair, this story, anything that could be translated into fire. So that is that first brief excerpt. I have another short section, which comes from my personal favorite part of the book, which is the parable of the pirate. And this is now the grandmother narrating to the granddaughter about the pirates that they are descended from. Okay. You tell the story like an animal, too much language. I prefer concision, a story with scissor blades, useful for what it can sever. Let's say your great-great-grandfather stole his name. Before empires and before men and before my hips began barking at me to sit down, back when blood was sweet, we lived in houses underground. We dug into the mountain soil that was so wet you could wring rivers from it. Our doors were holes. We came home by climbing down ladders. If home is beneath your feet, it means you're always home. We planted our shit in the ground to grow more mountains when we ran out. We didn't aspire upward, but downward. The deeper your house, the safer you were from sight, from soldiers, from grief engineered by armies. You think you dig holes in the yard because it's your idea? Digging is the design of your body. Holes are what marrow is made of. The empire had two categories for us, cooked and raw. If you married a mainlander and let them stew their children inside you, you were cooked. If you lived in the mountains and fucked rivers, you were raw. Grandfather Esau was yolk raw. He hard-boiled the whites of his eyes by looking directly at the sun and shooting it down. One day, men came up from the mountain with pots, ready to boil all the boys in the tribe. Esau volunteered to boil himself alive and go down the mountain to seek adventure. He fathered a dozen half-raw, half-cooked daughters. He fried you a family. He went to sea on a boat he'd stolen from a fisherman, cut the man's throat and speared him in the water. The blood summoned a shark, which swam off with the fisherman's hands in his mouth. He lived as a fisherman until his boat was boarded by a fleet of pirates. My grandfather did not mind being a pirate. He liked it better than fishing, and anything was better than being on land where everyone was trying to cook him. The pirates called him Three Blades, and yes, of course he carried 3 blades, all of them different lengths, all of them named after snakes, until he killed his first merchant. Esau took that merchant's name because he liked to collect names the way other men collected wives, and because it would help him pass for Chinese. Now all the pirates called him Old Guang. Back on land, my grandmother thought he'd capsized and died, and soon resigned herself to widowhood. She never minded it, really. She didn't love her husband any more than she loved having fungus between her toes. My aunts and uncles didn't miss him either. Old Guang was just a fart that infiltrated the house. Before he was kidnapped, we saw him only once a moon. The captain of this pirate fleet was a Tonka man named Ajin, younger than my grandfather, but taller, slender as a dagger. From afar, his ship looked like a mouth. The wood was sun-dyed white as a jawbone, and along the railing of the ship he'd embedded stakes of ivory that looked like teeth from a distance. The ivory stakes were a form of defense against being boarded. Most of Ajin's people had been slaughtered by the Cantonese, and piracy was vengeance. If they called him unfit for land life, he would wield the water as a whip. He would capture all their ships, welt their hulls, melt their foreign gold, and gild all his teeth in it. All his life, the shore was a father. He knew he would never be allowed to meet it. Fine by him, he preferred water to women. He had been conceived and born at sea. Some say he could sing to fish, that they threw themselves into the boat whenever he was hungry. The sea was his glittering garment. He was so blessed, even the storms bounced off his boat. Ajin resembled an ordinary hog on land, but was handsome on water, especially reflected off of the surface. He wore the hat of a Tonka, but underneath his hair was like water, stroking his shoulders, or coiling on its own. He was born with a blowhole on the top of his head that he liked to stick a miniature flag inside, a flag that was just a piece of toilet paper. His eyes were the bitter color of grapes. Always remember to spit out the grape skins, or you'll get eyes like that too, all seed. You'll see everything dark as light, everything loved as lost. All this to say, Old Guang, my beef-hearted, fish-sticked, hog-spawned grandfather, fell in love with Ajin. And that's the end of that little portion. More things happen, I promise. Thank you for listening.
Oh, thank you. That was a great combination of different excerpts. So let's get started with the interview portion. Let's see, can you tell us a bit about your inspiration for Bestiary?
Yeah, so the inspiration was definitely oral stories that I grew up hearing. Almost every story that is in this book is rooted in some form of fable or oral history that I heard, including the pirate story and the story of the gourd girl, which I read in the first excerpt as well. And I remember when I told my mom that this book was coming out, and she was like, "Oh, what is it about?" And I was like, "Oh, remember that tiger myth fable that used to tell me?" And she was like, "Oh my God, that story." She's like, "You pestered me so much. You forced me to tell you that story all the time." And I had to make up new versions just to keep you satisfied with it. And I just thought it was so funny that we had these kind of different interpretations of this story. And I love that with oral story and oral history, that there could be so many different versions of the story, that it was kind of coming through the body. and that there wasn't really a canonical or fixed version of any narrative. It was always fluid and always based on a relationship, which is why so much of the book is like one person telling someone another story. It's always about that relationship as much as it is about the story itself.
Oh, you got to the next question already. Did you want to talk a little bit more about some of the myths, or maybe your favorite myths from this?
Yeah, so the big, I guess it's right here in my background, like, ooh, like a PowerPoint presentation. The kind of central story is about the daughter of the family growing a tiger tail, and that's based on a children's folklore or folk tale / song called Hukupo, which is about a woman who has a tiger spirit living inside her. She eats the toes of children and calls them peanuts, which I thought was really charming, that she called the toes peanuts, and I felt a lot of empathy for her and wanted to know what kind of person she would be. And I think it really, for me, began to be about kind of understanding this quote unquote villainous woman and the way that she was cast as this villain because she didn't have these, maternal instincts that kind of were expected and continue to be expected of women. And so I was just really fascinated with what does it mean for this woman to contain a tiger spirit inside her and to have this kind of insatiable hunger and to not be a kind of self-sacrificial mother figure. And through the lens of that story, I could kind of examine the lives of and interiority and desires of the women in the story.
Was the tiger woman, was she a very similar version to what you portrayed in your story, or did you adapt it from the folklore?
Well, actually, the original story, it's actually kind of very similar to Little Red Riding Hood in that it's about a brother and a sister who kind of let this grandmother figure into their life. And then they wake up and realize that their toes are missing, like one a day, and realize that it's her that's eating them and calling them peanuts. And they actually boil her in a vat of boiling water and oil, and they get her to jump down from a tree into the vat of boiling water or oil. And that always made me really sad. I knew I was supposed to kind of cheer for her death and cheer for this kind of triumph over this like evil mother figure, but I was really interested in kind of humanizing this woman who'd been kind of cast as a predator. And it was kind of about bringing a different, I think, gaze and lens to it. And I didn't want her to die. So in this version of the story, she is kind of just this kind of living figure and symbol that continually haunts this family and isn't, extinguished in that way, that is so kind of cleanly wrapped up in the story, which is a little bit, I think, more moralistic. Yeah.
I guess kind of tying into the part that you read aloud, how did writing bestiary compare to writing poetry? Because it was quite poetic, and what motivated your genre change?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think that for me, the processes of writing poetry and prose are really similar. For me, it's a lot about accumulating language over time rather than kind of conceiving of a linear narrative to progress. I tend to think of like, what kind of language or images can accumulate rather than what's going to happen, which can make for some very not great prose. So it's definitely an instinct that I have to kind of learn to navigate. And yeah, I think for me, I just started to realize that my poetry was becoming increasingly narrative. And it's not that I don't think that poetry can hold narrative, because it definitely can. I think I just had such kind of high expectations for myself with poetry that I didn't really quite feel that sense of, I'm a total amateur and I can do anything on the page, and it can just be play, it can be experimentation. I think with poetry, I put so much pressure on myself to, think about form and think about metaphor. And I realized that switching genres and feeling just like an absolute beginner, like I had no idea what I was doing. I had no idea about the conventions of the form, and that it kind of liberated me and allowed me to feel, like a kind of playful amateur. And it was a very liberating process, I think, to be working in a new form with this story.
think a little bit change of topic. Did you have an audience in mind when you wrote Bestiary?
I didn't. I was really writing for myself, which I guess is kind of an audience. And it's something that's very rare for me. I think that it's really difficult for me to admit that I'm writing for myself or to kind of feel that way. But for this, it really did feel like I was writing fan fiction about my family. And I still joke to people that this book is just fan fiction and of various narratives that I really love and resonated with. But there was also, I don't know, that I always imagine kind of reading them aloud as well, the way that my family would tell stories aloud, you know, after dinner, and have these kind of increasingly preposterous tales become more and more exaggerated. An element of the theatrical is something that I was always thinking about as I was writing. So maybe what I wanted to do is to just read it out loud to myself, which sounds really weird now that I say it out loud. But yeah, that was, I wasn't really thinking of it as, you know, a novel or a full project while I was writing.
Have you read it to your family, or has your family read it?
No, it's really funny because my mom is like very uninterested in things that don't have a strong plot. She's like, I want to read about serial killers. I want to read about like crime thrillers. Like that's her genre of choice. And I think that this is not quite as exciting as she would probably hope. But I have been really surprised and excited by how many people I didn't envision it would reach or resonate with. Just like people from my friend group who responded really strongly to it. Like that has been so unexpected and really wonderful. Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about intergenerational relationship. So having a daughter, mother, and grandmother, it was a very intriguing framework for the novel. And did you start writing Bestiary with those 3 points of view in mind already?
Yeah, that's a great question. I didn't realize that they would be, while I was writing it, the bulk of the book, and the bulk of the book still now, is from the daughter's perspective, the third generation of the family. But as I was writing, I felt like the mother's voice kept surfacing in all these ways. And so it's almost like each of the voices, individual voices, was kind of layered over another voice, and that they weren't all really distinct. In the book, all 3 of them are first-person narrators that aren't super distinct from each other. They use a lot of the same vocabulary, a lot of the same cadence and syntax, and that was all because I could kind of see obsessions and desires that had been kind of deferred rise up in each generation. And I realized that all of these generations, it wasn't about like, oh, one generation moving far from the other. It was about how they were all circling the same obsessions and had to return to each other in a lot of ways. And so, yeah, I slowly realized that there were these other very urgent voices beneath the voice that I was writing. And I kind of was able to write into the 3 different characters by following that.
I guess coming off of that question, why did you choose to write about a family that's so strongly affected by generational trauma?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't realize that's what I was writing about, because it's such a, like, if someone had been like, you will write, 250 pages on intergenerational trauma, I would have been so intimidated and really frightened. And I think that the vehicle of hupupo and this idea that every generation kind of feels like they have inherited this capacity for violence and the capacity to hurt people was something that was really interesting to me. Because I think oftentimes when we think about intergenerational violence, we think about kind of inheriting the wound and inheriting the experience, having experienced violence. But I also really wanted to think about what does it mean to inherit the capacity to do that violence and to continue that violence in all of these, in this kind of continual cycle. So I think what really helped me find the very circular structure of the book, because it's not super linear, like even the choice of the structures and the various metaphors and the images, I realized all of them were about like what it means to inherit something, and what it means for that inheritance to be very complicated. And I didn't realize that was what I was doing until very late into the drafting process. But yeah, I think I wanted to know, like, oh, what does it mean to have this kind of tiger predator that also is like a part of your desires and the ways that you show love as well. Yeah.
All ties in together. A little bit of symbolism or symbolism question. There are a lot of holes mentioned all throughout the book. What do the holes represent? One single thing or multiple things?
Well, so it's really funny because the holes came through a later stage editorial decision. So it wasn't in the original draft, but what I realized is that first that I love the pun of like whole H-O-L-E and whole W-H-O-L-E, because there's a lot of kind of debate between the mother and daughter what it means to be a whole person, which I think is part of what we were talking about earlier about intergenerational violence, this feeling of like, well, I'm born already unwhole, like I'm born unwhole, what does that mean? And their anxieties about that, and then also the image of the holes kind of opening the backyard. But what I really wanted to think about with the holes is how typically we think of holes as like very passive. It's something that you inflict force onto something and it creates a hole. But I really wanted these holes to be living and breathing and to have agency and to be active and not passive. And so they speak and they throw up and they poop and they're very alive. And I was also thinking a lot about like Taiwanese indigenous storytelling traditions of like the land as also a kind of living being. And that all kind of contributed to the holes being mouthed very literally in the book. Yeah.
I hadn't thought about many of those different interpretations. Let's talk about, so in another interview, you're asked about your writing, which is often filled with like sensory images that can be sometimes seen as disgusting. Your answer in that interview was the ability to distance yourself from bodily functions is sometimes about class. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, there are kind of multiple prongs to the kind of bodiliness of the book. One of them was just that I felt that the kind of these things that are kind of considered disgusting in our social context, when you're with people you're really intimate with, are really perceived as disgusting. Like I noticed that with the people that I'm closest to, discussing my bodily state and my bodily functions are not, it's not seen as so kind of taboo or scary. And so I really wanted to cultivate that really intense intimacy between these characters where they're not ashamed to talk about their bodies or to reference their bodies to each other in that way. And then also regarding what I was saying about that statement as well, I was thinking specifically, I can give an example of like the mother, when she first, the mother, when she first immigrates, her job is at a chicken farm and she's, literally kind of scraping poop with a palette knife. And so the bodiliness of that, the inability to separate oneself from blood and gore and guts and feces, that has to do with like the nature of her labor and how her entire body is kind of invaded by that job as well. Like there's a scene where she inhales feathers and dust, and so it becomes a part of her body. And that's a lot of what I was thinking about too, in terms of body and labor.
I do have to say some of the descriptions did catch me by surprise, but I can see what you mean now. Let's do the time. Was one of your goals to write LGBTQ people into myth, history, and family? And if so, can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I when I was talking about fan fiction, I did really mean it in that way, in that I was thinking, I can't be the only one, and this desire to not feel so lonely in my lineage. And so I was like, yes, I want to write all of these queer ancestors, because I'm sure they exist or have existed in ways that have just not been conceived of. And what does it mean to make your own ancestors, to choose your own ancestors? And I think that is a very kind of queer impulse that I was writing into. And so I was like, yeah, I'm going to have these kind of chosen ancestors that I write into existence. And definitely thinking about mythology is so queer. It kind of defies all of the kind of, I don't know, it kind of defies all of these storytelling expectations. I feel like mythology is full of transformation, is full of kind of like bodily fantasy and all of these things that when I was reading, I was like, oh, these are the queer stories that I was already living with. And also like this idea of the monster in myth or the beast in myth is something I'm really interested in, because I wanted to think about like, oh, what does it mean to feel like a monster or a beast, to feel strange, or to feel like something that has never existed before. And I think that all of those questions could be kind of transformed and explored through myth in a way that felt really freeing and strange.
I'm still just sort of laughing at how you use the word fan fiction, but yeah. Maybe let's do one more question, then we can move on to audience questions.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Let's see. What were your influences and favorite authors?
Yeah, I had so many influences for this book. One of them was Carmelo by Sandra Cisneros. And I remember I picked up this book at a library sale and I was reading it, and there's a section where the grandmother kind of interrupts the granddaughter and her voice is in bold text. And she's like, you're telling this story wrong. That's not how it happened. You stop saying that. And it was so immediately familiar. And it was something that I was like, oh my God, I didn't know you could do this in storytelling. I thought fiction was very formal in this way. I didn't know if you could have this character, this other consciousness just interject. And that you can kind of see those influences in the story too, because it feels like there are different characters kind of hijacking the narrative at different times. And I really love that. It felt like a kind of co-ownership of the story by different family members. And then other books are thinking about like Maxine Hong Kingston's work, specifically her book Chinamen, which is so mythical and so strange and so experimental. And yeah, just non-linear and also full of kind of like speculative history as well. We the Animals by Joycelyn Torres, I think writes like the kind of balance of violence and intimacy within a family in a way that was just really affecting. And this book called Revenge of the Mooncake Vixen by Marilyn Chin was something I returned to after drafting this book. But I just love the retelling of myths and fables and also how irreverent it is. I thought that was, I don't know, so playful. Yeah.
I like the part in Bestiary when you were reading the letters, and then even while reading those letters, I think what Ben was interjecting with footnotes, and I found that like just another layer of those different stories that you added. It was great.
Yeah, Carmelo uses footnotes in a really interesting way. So I definitely got inspiration from that. I think the way that the footnotes are used in that book is very different, but I remember thinking like, you can have footnotes in fiction. Like, is that real? Is that a thing? And I think it's, yeah, these kind of these novels that were experimenting with form and structure that blew my mind, because I had no idea you could write that way. That you could write like the way that people tell stories and kind of exchange narratives, and so that was really amazing. Yeah.
Let's move on to some questions from the audience. We've got one question. Do you have any future book plans?
Oh yeah. So for next year, I have a short story collection coming out called Gods of Want. And it explores a lot of really similar themes. As Bestiary, it's also kind of fabulous and uses a lot of speculative and supernatural elements. But I think it's overall, and it even shows kind of my maturation as a writer. Hopefully, I hope so. Fingers crossed. Yeah, and I'm also kind of dabbling in a few other projects. But Bestiary for now is kind of living her own life out there in the world. So no specific plans. Yeah.
Another question. Who are your author heroes and who inspired you to write?
Yeah, I mean, there were a couple I just, that I mentioned, Mary Lynch, Maxine Hong Kingston. I love Dorothy Allison. Her short story collection, Trash, is just incredible. I love Benita Blackburn, who has a book, I think, that just came out today, called How to Wrestle a Girl, which is, all of her work is just really incredible. And I love what she does with the very short fiction form. And the writers that inspired me to write, I believe, was the second part of the question. I actually kept a journal when I was a kid of gossip and drama, and like who was boyfriends with who on the elementary school playground, and like, oh, which aunt told me this wild story that later this other person contradicted. And so I feel like gossip and kind of the oral storytelling form really influenced me to write, and all of these kind of transmitted stories were my first form of writing. Those journals still exist, and they're very extensive, and they're full of lies.
Yeah. How many journals do you have?
Oh, there are at least like 12 really gigantic, thick notebooks of just concocted lies and thoughts that and gossip that I overheard and eavesdropped on that I wrote down.
So story fodder, right?
Exactly. I mean, I haven't revisited them because I'm a little too scared, but they exist somewhere.
Oh, there's another one. Why do you focus so much on The Daughter's Tale, and was it just what inspired you?
Well, actually, it's funny because The Tale was another thing that came out during edits, or that was extended during edits. So originally in my draft of the book, it was a really short, brief chapter. The tale lasted for like 5-10 pages. And I was just kind of interested in this animal-human hybridity, especially in mythology and folk tales. And then I remember my editor at the time, Victory Matsui, wrote to me that maybe this tale could be kind of a tether, a kind of touchstone for the narrator. And I was really interested in that. And so I decided that the tale would be kind of a living companion to her, and that it would be a kind of double-edged sword in terms of inheritance, that it was both something that in some contexts could be, empowering, and that she could control it and wield it. And then at other times it feels like she is being controlled by it, or that it represents some kind of seed of evil that she believes she was somehow born with. Obviously, the reality of the tale is somewhere kind of in between. It ended up being a very complicated thing. And I actually had an original ending where she cuts off the tail. But I remember thinking to myself that that was kind of too clean and too neat of an ending, and that she would have to kind of live with this inherited tale that was, kind of a complex inheritance. Yeah.
It would have been a bit too clean of a fairy tale ending if you had, I think, cut off the tail, maybe.
Yeah, it would have been too too easy. And so I had Ben intervene, because of course she would, and be like, don't do that. And I was like, yes, I think that it feels like a truer ending to a story about intergenerational trauma and violence, is that she has to kind of live with, that she lives with this living umbilical cord / weapon, and that it will always continually shapeshift and grow. Yeah.
Got another question. Have you read any Lisa C books?
No, I haven't actually. I have not. There are so many things I have yet to read, and that are continually kind of growing on my table back there. But no, I have not. I'm sorry.
Next question. What are you reading right now then?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, there's a book that recently came out called Ghost Forest by Picture and Fung, and I got to do an event with her. She's absolutely incredible, and the book is just amazing. So highly recommend Ghost Forest. I'm actually reading Annie John by Jamaica Kincaid right now. And I also just recently finished, what did I recently finish? Oh, I finished a reread of Jamaica Kincaid's short story collection called At the Bottom of the River, which I love to return to as well.
Need to expand my to-be-read list with all of those. Let's see, another question. Sorry, just looking at a couple options. When you're talking about bestiary, did you come up with the characters first, or was it like the language of the story?
Oh, that's a great question. I think the very first section of the book, I actually ended up cutting out of the book, which was really interesting, because I wanted to write about the grandfather figure as kind of this patriarchal figure that all the other characters revolve around. And I quickly realized that the story was actually about the women and less about him. So that was a kind of interesting shift. So it began with the story and the figure of the grandfather and the various ways in which the women of the family kind of grapple with each other over his presence and who he represents to them. So I would say the character relationships were kind of what sparked my impulse to write this story, but it was the mythology that gave me, I think, all of the tools that I needed, because there were these narratives that I feel like I could write into, but also write against, which was really wonderful.
How do you think one can work against passing along more intergenerational trauma / violence, aside from reading books like this?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Speaking of reading books about intergenerational violence, there's a book by Edouard Louis called Who Killed My Father, which is a translated book. And there's this one sentence in it that continually haunts me and will continue to haunt me forever, which is, he wrote, "Violence saved me from violence." And in that particular sentence, he was talking about how his own father vowed never to be physically abusive towards his children because he himself had experienced that. And so Edouard Louis was writing about how he felt that because his father had endured violence, he was so conscious and aware of it. And that just was really, I don't know, it really haunted me. And I was like, oh God, I can't get it out of my head. But anyway, that's kind of irrelevant to the question. That was just something that popped into my mind as you were speaking. Yeah, I don't know. I feel like someone who's like a licensed therapist would definitely have a more, a more holistic and insightful answer. But I think that definitely telling stories is really is all I can do. And I remember the beginning of Maxine Hunkinson's The Woman Warrior is, "You must not tell anyone, my mother said, what I'm about to tell you." That's an approximate. That's an approximate rendition of that line. And I thought that was so incredible to begin this book with a story of not wanting to be complicit in silence. And that by being complicit for so many generations in silencing what had happened to a woman of a previous generation, she had kind of, that she was actively fighting against that and wanted to no longer be silent and complicit in that violence. And that was how she opened the story, which I was like, such a power move to begin a book by saying, "You must not tell anyone what I'm about to tell you. Now let me tell you the story." And so, yeah, I don't have any answers. Besides that, there are many other writers who write about this topic that continually inspire me to, think about what storytelling can do.
That was a pretty good answer. Talking about editing, it sounds like you seem to place a critical role of your editor. Are there instances where you didn't want to change or reform your narrative? Would you share this?
Yeah, so my editors played a huge role. My editors, Victory Matsui and Nicole Counts, played a huge role in the shaping of this book. And basically every element that any reader has ever told me that they loved, I'm like, that's because of edits. That's because of developmental edits. The tiger tail, Ben and the narrator's relationship, the holes, all these things that feel very crucial and critical to the spine of this book were all through editorial conversations and through developmental edits. So yeah, it's just, there were instances, I think, sometimes where there were like suggestions to exclude parts of the book that I felt that even if they weren't fully part of the quote unquote plot of the book, I felt was just extremely important to keep. And I think what allowed me, like there were moments where I was like, you know what, there's this entire paragraph about daughter and her mother watching Desperate Housewives. And I know that that's not critical to the plot, and I know that it might seem really extraneous, but it just felt deeply important to me in their relationship. And so I think for me, what I had to do in order to keep a kind of compass is to think about the book in its final form, and what I would grieve if it was not included in the book, and what felt kind of core to the process, and to kind of hold true to those things. But I'm very lucky that my editors were always kind of very, very open in terms of conversations, and we're never like, you have to do this or you have to do that. It all felt like the conversations began with, what do you envision for the book, which is really wonderful.
Another question, when you heard the original stories from your family, were they told you in English or Chinese?
Most of the folk tales in the book, like Meng Jiang Yu or Hu Bu Po, those were told in Chinese. Oftentimes there are song forms that rhyme. So it's very important that they be said in, in one language or the other, so that the kind of rhymes and cadence of it are preserved. But what I really loved about these stories is that they often, like the one's personal language and idiosyncrasies within a language kind of emerge in these stories. So I remember one time my mom was telling me the story of the tiger spirit, Hu Bu Po, and she was like, and here's a commercial break. And she just invented a commercial in the middle of the story and was like, product placement. And then she, she threw this like can of soda onto the roof, and her brother caught it and said, yeah, this soda is great. And I just loved that the language of infomercial made its way into these stories, because we had been watching a lot of soap operas and things like that. And so that kind of infiltrated these stories. So I loved how just like different kinds of language, could influence our like oral way of telling a story, and how the story could continually shift and become stranger.
Do you remember what brand of soda she was advertising to you?
No, it was made up. It was an entirely made up commercial break. I, at the time, being a very impatient child, was very annoyed with the impromptu commercial break. I was like, get to the part where they boil the oil, because I was like bloodthirsty or something as a child. But yeah, it was very amusing, and very, again, I keep using the word playful, but like that's kind of, I think that was kind of the overarching spirit of the story. Yeah.
Playful and like evolving.
Yeah. Exactly.
Let's do another question. Talking about you wrote Bestiary while you were still in college. How did you find the time? And do you have any other advice, or do you have any advice for other young authors?
Yeah, well, while I was in school, I had a job where I could sit down in a computer lab for long periods of time, and I think that was very conducive. Sorry, there's a bird in my background, but hopefully you can hear me. But that was very conducive to secretly writing while supposed to be clocking in. So I had a lot of time where I was in a library and had access to just sit at a computer. And so I was able to kind of write for extended periods of time. And I think what was really important to me, interestingly, was that I had to not feel like I was in an academic space to write Bestiary. I think because it was so incredibly nebulous, that I felt a little bit more protective of it than I would when I was writing poetry. And so it was really important for it to be, completely separate from things like a grade, or a class or workshop. I think for that particular project, it was really important for me to, I don't know, feel kind of illicit when I was writing it. Like, oh, here's me writing my fan fiction, just here typing away, and to kind of feel like it belonged to me in that way.
A general question about the book cover artwork. Did you have much say in it, or did you want to just discuss the book cover?
Yeah, I have elements of it on my screen. My publisher made this background. But yeah, I got multiple options for it, and this was the option that we felt had the most amount of movement in it. And what I really love about this cover is that people often tell me that it feels like a scavenger hunt, because as you read the book, different elements of the cover start to make sense. Because I think when you look at the disparate elements, like the red goose and the bones and the letters and the tail in the hole, they seem very collaged, and maybe that they don't belong together. And it was really fun to hear people as they were reading, be like, oh, and then I flipped back to the cover and I was like, oh, that's what the red goose is. Like, oh, it gave birth to that. Oh, that's what the bones are. So I really love that it's kind of a map. The cover is kind of a map to the book, to the interior of the book. Yeah, and I remember that when the cover first came in, there were a couple things. I think the girl was wearing shoes, and the bones were different. And we were like, oh, I think, she wouldn't be wearing shoes. Like, she would have like the soil beneath her feet. And so like little bits, I was able to give my input. But as a whole, when the cover came, I had this feeling of like, oh, this is the book, or this is the cover that all of the elements feel very alive to me.
Oh, I like that you could have an input in it, because usually you hear authors saying they don't have any input in the cover.
Yeah, I got to actually, because there were 2 out of the 3 covers that I was interested in, so I actually got to see different versions of both of those covers, which is really, really wonderful. Yeah.
I can't remember if it is exactly the same on the book. Does she have no eyes on the main cover? Was that on purpose?
No, I'm not sure. I think that just might be the way the artwork is. But I like that it really focuses on the striped body and her tail. So I don't mind it.
And then was it the paperback version or the new release that has an actual tiger? Have you seen that cover?
Yeah,
I'm sure.
The UK version of the book, which I have here, which my background is now blurring, but hopefully if I hold it in front of my body like this, you can see it. Is a full illustration of a tiger done by an artist named Jinhua Zhang. And it has like a crab and a fish and a snake on it as well. So it's kind of all of the animals. It's the bestiary of this book represented in the artwork. But it's the UK version of the book. Yeah.
So they added different symbols than the ones that were chosen for this cover, the US cover.
Yeah, it's really interesting what the UK publisher kind of picked up with the book compared to the US publisher. I think it's really wonderful that I got to, I don't know, I feel very lucky that I got to see these kind of 2 different interpretations of the cover. And the UK publisher, Harville Secker, who are just an amazing group of people, they commissioned an artist to actually create an original artwork for the cover. And that's where the tiger and like the snake hose come in. But I really love that both covers kind of represent, it's like A side, B side of the book. they're two different faces of the work. And I think both are very, very true to what's inside.
Yeah, one of them kind of focuses on the daughter, and they show that aspect. I think if people picked up the book, different versions, they might have very different expectations also. Yeah. Let's see, so I don't know if we have any other questions. Oh, one more question just came in. Perfect. Do you ever plan on writing a murder mystery so that your mom will read your work?
So funny. Will I become the next Joe Nesbo? That's the real question. Well, should I write Scandinavian noir? If only I could. No, I'm not sure. I think it's really funny because she has all these ideas for next books that she wants me to write. She's like, oh, you should write about this and you should write about that. And that's been really fun and wonderful to get all of these ideas. I don't know if I'll ever write any of them, but I'm really delighted that she has so many ideas. And I'm like, you should write that book. I think everybody would be very excited if you wrote, if you wrote this book idea. So I will rally us all together to encourage her to write the book of her dreams.
You could do family writing, yeah. Let's see. Bestiary features the 3 narrators, as you've talked about. Did one person's voice come to you first, and how did you come up with the final structure? I think you kind of covered some of that, but.
Yeah, I think the structure was one of the most major kind of editorial processes, because originally the very first draft of this book was actually a collection of kind of speculative magical essays. So there wasn't really a kind of unifying thread through all the pieces, and there still really only tenuously is a unifying thread through all these pieces. But I think what I realized was that the order in my head that I was so fixated on needed to just be completely turned on its head. And so that was one thing that my editors were extremely helpful with, which was just figuring out how all the different pieces would kind of fold into each other and what the through lines would be. It ended up being very literal forms of through lines, like a river as a through line, a tail as a through line. It was all these very elongated, flowing things. And I really like the metaphor of the structure of the book being a river, because it is kind of so focused on rivers. I have an epigraph that's about a river. It's an epigraph by Liang Li, poet extraordinaire. The name of the river is what it says, is the epigraph. Yeah, so I was just interested in, how can we have this through line, but also have all of these digressions in all of these places where the narrative diverges. And I thought something like a river was a really great visual that I could keep in my mind, of just, allowing for digressive paths and for things to kind of flow away from what might be seen as the main story. Yeah.
Oh, which reminded me of another question. So you do use a lot of water in the book. Is there a particular symbolism for water that you wanted to bring in, or does it symbolize anything in particular?
Yeah, no, I'm very obsessed with writing about water. Either the kind of extreme of water, and also, well, what's really interesting is that two of the major places in the book are Taiwan and California. And California is characterized by drought and the absence of water, the lack of water, dryness. And Taiwan is just extremely, lots of rain, lots of typhoons, the ocean, surrounded by the ocean. It's an island, and water is incredibly abundant. The humidity, it's kind of the extremes of weather, I think are two very different things. And so I was really interested, in writing about water in terms of place, but also water as kind of, again, a living thing, like the land, water having its own sentience, the river having its own sentience. There's a myth in the book about the river that kind of gets up out of its bed and is a woman, and kind of roams on her own. And that was deeply important to, again, to the kind of Taiwanese folklore that I had grown up hearing, was, again, land and water being animate and containing consciousness and being alive. So I was really interested. I'm like, yes, what would water be like? And how would it, move at night if none of us were watching, and all of those things. Yeah.
Question, do you like Taiwanese films or TV? I'd be interested in hearing what you like, if so, for some recommendations.
There was actually a film that really influenced, not directly, it didn't influence the book directly, but a lot of the imagery from the film kind of stuck with me as I was writing. And I kept a couple of screenshots of this particular film, but it's called A Brighter Summer Day, directed by Edward Yang. And I remember I walked into this movie with a friend, and we both didn't know it was like 4.5 hours long. And we were like, oh yeah, it's a 2-hour long movie. But I was riveted the entire time, like absolutely riveted, which I never thought I would be, unless it was Lord of the Rings. Then I would also be riveted. But this is, because I love Lord of the Rings. But 4.5 hours of this, it's very slice of life. It is about a boy growing up during martial law, and there is a murder in it, but it's very anticlimactic, and it's very not about plot. And just the images of Taiwan under martial law, and also the image of like, I don't know, like tatami mats and these sliding screen doors, and this house, and the way the cars look, the way people are dressed, it felt like the stories that had been told had come to life in a way that I just, before, I had never kind of seen it so vividly. And so that the characters in that movie, I think, really haunt me. And it's riveting, and not a lot happens, but also a lot happens. I don't know, it's full of contradictions, but visually definitely stuck with me as I was writing.
Maybe let's do one more question. Let's see. As a young author, do you have any other advice to give? And was it difficult to find an agent and sell your book at such a young age?
I feel like I have no good advice. I feel like I'm the one who needs the advice, truly. But yeah, no, I feel really lucky because I think that I found people who believed in the work almost more than I could, who were able to see it in a way that it kind of was something new in my own eyes. And I managed to find the group of people who, could really see the core of it and what I was trying to do. And so I feel like I got very lucky in terms of querying and finding an agent, Julia Cardin, who represents Bestiary and who, was immediately like, oh, these snakes. Instead of being really weirded out, I was like, oh my God, everyone's gonna be so weirded out by these snakes. Like, everyone's gonna find it so repulsive. And she was just like, oh, these snakes. Like, there was just a level of belief in the work that I think, it was very, very lucky. And made the process feel, very communal as well, which is really wonderful. It felt like there were so many different people who were kind of involved in the creation of the book. And I can see like traces, like I'll look back at a line and be like, oh, I remember so-and-so really loved this line and I kept it in. Like I can see traces of my editors and my agent within the book, which I think is, really wonderful. Yeah, I know I use that word a lot, but it really does feel that way.
It sounds like a great experience. Yeah, collaborative, and how you were saying you were discussing everything about it rather than being delegated. So, I think, we are actually at time. So thank you so much. And it's been a great conversation. I feel like I need to reread the book to analyze everything you've mentioned. Basically, thank you for coming, K-Ming. We can't wait for your short story collection. Do you know exactly when it's coming out next year?
It'll be July 10th, 2022.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, can't wait to see that, Gods of Want. And thank you everyone for coming, who joined us tonight. Please check out some of our upcoming author talks if you go to smcl.org/events. We'd also appreciate if you tell us how SMCL did with this program at smcl.org/rate this event. And otherwise, thank you again, K-Ming, for coming, and have a good night, everybody.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming out. And thank you, Jenna, for such a lovely conversation and for your thoughtful questions. I'm just very grateful.
Oh, thank you, and good luck with all your writing.
Thank you. Have a good night, all.